Hey guys, tonight we journey deep into the wintry shadow of the Viking Age, into a ritual so gruesome, so bizarre, that even Odin himself might wince. You find yourself alone beneath a heavy gray sky, standing on the edge of a Scandinavian fjord. The water laps quietly at the rocks, but there's something uneasy in the air, like a drumbeat muffled under snow. Beyond the trees, a Viking warband is gathering. Their fire crackles faintly, and in the distance you can just make out the rough timbre of Old Norse low, deliberate like a chant. Or a curse. Your breath fogs in the cold air. You step forward, boots crunching against frostbitten moss, as the warriors form a silent circle around something or someone. The man in the center is bound, stripped to the waist, kneeling. Then someone unslings an axe. That's when it hits you. This is no ordinary execution. You've wandered into something older, darker. The Blood Eagle. Now, you might be wondering, surely they didn't really do this, right? You're not alone. Historians today still argue whether it ever happened or whether it was just medieval marketing at its goriest. But tonight, you're here, you're in it, and you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Blink once. The snow is falling harder now. The smell of pine smoke mixes with something metallic. The circle of men shifts slightly, and you realize every eye is on the victim, not out of anger, but reverence. This isn't just punishment. It's theater, ceremony, a message written in flesh. And that's the thing. The Blood Eagle wasn't some random act of violence. It was a ritual, a gruesome one, yes, but one that lived at the crossroads of belief, fear, and raw spectacle. You hear one warrior mutter a name, King Gla. That's the legendary victim, right? The Northumbrian king who, according to the Norse sagas, executed the father of Ragnar Lothbrok, only to be captured and carved open in revenge. But did it really happen? Did they actually slice open his back, snap his ribs, and pull out his lungs to make wings? Let's not jump ahead. First, you crouch near the fire, listening in as these rough, frost-bitten men prepare. The executioner, if you can call him that, doesn't wear a mask. He's not hiding. His hands are steady. The blade is sharpened. There's no screaming yet. Just the eerie quiet of a people who believe they are doing something sacred. You notice one of them tossing herbs into the flames. A subtle, almost minty smell floats up. Could this have been part of the ritual? Maybe it's not mentioned in the sagas, but some believe hallucinogens may have played a role, not for the victim, no, but for the witnesses. To make the ritual feel larger than life, more myth than murder. A raven calls in the trees above. Of course it does. That's Odin's bird, the Allfather's watchful eye. It's always there in these stories, hovering like a feathered punctuation, marked to every act of divine cruelty. The kneeling man doesn't resist. His hands are bound, yes, but he's not thrashing or begging. That's not how it worked. If you were chosen for the Blood Eagle, you were usually someone of note. A noble, a warrior, maybe even a king. And resisting? That would only prove your cowardice. Instead, You sit in the frost and watch as he accepts his fate. In your peripheral vision, a child is watching, 2, maybe 12 or 13. A son? A future warrior? You wonder what this boy sees. Justice? Vengeance? A story to tell by firelight in 20 years? Then the axe comes down. No, not to kill. That's the twist. The blood eagle wasn't meant to be a quick death. The first cuts were made down the back, along the spine, skin peeled back, ribs exposed, each bone cracked outward like the frame of a wing. That's the idea, anyway. Would someone actually survive this long enough for their lungs to be pulled out and displayed like feathers? Maybe. If the cuts avoided major arteries, if the victim was strong, if the gods weren't quite ready for them yet. That's what makes it horrifying. Not just the pain, but the intent behind it. It wasn't violence for violence's sake. It was message, and the message was clear. Mess with us, and this is what you get. Not just death, but transformation. From man to myth. You blink, and suddenly the scene shifts. A different fire, a different winter, maybe even a different century. But the ritual looks the same heavy silence, the same sharpened blades, the same refusal to look away. Even now, you can feel your breath slowing, your heart beating a little heavier. This isn't just a bedtime story. This is the part of Viking history that makes people flinch. Not because of blood, but because of belief. Because someone, somewhere, thought this mattered. One scholar once called it surgical theater. Another dismissed it entirely as Christian fan fiction. And you know what? They're both kind of right. That's the beauty of myth wrapped in history. It leaves just enough room to wonder. The wind shifts again, and the fjord fades. The fire dims, but something lingers. Not the blood, not the blade, the silence. Because in that silence, a message was carved, not into just flesh, but into time. And you're just getting started. The cold hasn't left you yet. It creeps beneath your cloak, settling into your bones like a whisper of the past that refuses to be forgotten. You're moving now, feet crunching over ice-laced soil, following the war party into the woods. But this isn't just a hunt or a raid. Tonight, you're part of something different, something ceremonial. The Vikings ahead of you don't speak much. Their breath puffs out in silent clouds, their eyes fixed ahead, as if mentally preparing for a performance rather than a punishment. And that's where the truth of the blood eagle begins to unfold. Because despite what you may have heard, this execution wasn't simply about killing. It was about ritual, about meaning, about the performance of death. You duck beneath a low branch, its needles frosted white. Through the trees ahead, firelight glows again. Another clearing, another stage. The condemned is already there. This time, it's not a king. It's a nobleman, a traitor, maybe even someone once beloved. But no longer. A low chant begins. You realize it's not just for intimidation. It's part of the rhythm of the ritual. Some scholars believe the blood eagle may have been accompanied by verses from Eddic poetry or skaldic songs, maybe even improvised. Not necessarily to honor the victim, but to turn the moment into legend. Words to accompany the wings. You pause. Near the edge of the clearing. It's not your place to enter. Instead, you watch as two men step forward, possibly relatives of the victim's enemy. The honor of carving wasn't random. It was a gift and a burden, sometimes bestowed upon sons seeking revenge or brothers eager to reclaim family honor. And, again, the tools, not gleaming steel, not surgical precision. Just iron knives, bone-handled blades, and sometimes axes, heavy, brutal, but not clumsy. Because here's the thing, they didn't want the victim to die quickly. That would miss the point. You watch as one warrior starts from the lower back, slicing upward in clean, practiced motions. There's no fumbling. This is choreography, dark as it is. The blood starts slow. The chanting grows louder. The smoke smells of pine, iron, and something earthy, wet moss, or perhaps burnt offerings. This is no ordinary execution. It's an event. And yet, you're probably thinking what every modern mind does. But why? Why go to such extremes? Why such theatrical pain? You'd think it was purely about revenge. And that is part of it. But here's a twist. The blood eagle may have also had religious roots. Some interpretations suggest it was a form of human sacrifice, an offering to Odin, the Norse god of war, wisdom, and death. The wings, the breathless suffering, the open lungs, all meant to honor the god who gave his eye for knowledge and hung himself on the world tree to understand runes. It's not out of the question. In the Viking worldview, pain wasn't necessarily the enemy. It was a currency, a gift, a signal to the gods that you were serious and dying well. That was the golden ticket to Valhalla. So maybe, just maybe, the blood eagle wasn't just about punishment. It was a passage. You sit back on your heels, watching the ceremony unfold. There's no screaming this time. The victim is either too far gone or too far proud. Viking sources mention that enduring the blood eagle without crying out was a mark of true strength, a final chance to secure one's name in the afterlife. And while we're on the topic of sources, here's where things get murky. Our main accounts of the blood eagle come from later Norse sagas, epic stories like the Orkney Inga saga or Ragnarsona Hatter, the tale of Ragnar's sons. But those were written well after the Viking Age, sometimes centuries later. They're part myth, part history, and part marketing. In other words, these might not be newspapers. They're more like Hollywood scripts written to impress, inspire, and occasionally terrify. One saga tells of how King Glea of Northumbria was captured after killing Ragnar Lothbrok, and how Ragnar's sons carved the blood eagle into his back in revenge. But the earliest version of the tale doesn't mention blood or lungs or wings. That part only shows up in later retellings. Historians still argue whether the original stories were metaphorical. He cut the eagle in his back could mean a sword-shaped emblem or symbolic attack, or whether they were meant to be taken literally. You shift slightly. Your legs are numb from kneeling. But the ritual isn't over yet. As the ribs are cracked outward, spread like eagle's wings. As the poets say, another man steps forward. He's holding something. You squint through the smoke. Feathers. He begins to place them gently along the exposed ribs. One by one, slowly, almost tenderly. Okay, this part, total speculation. But some fringe theories suggest that feathers or symbolic items may have been used to complete the transformation, literally giving the appearance of wings, not just to humiliate the victim, but to elevate them, because if this was a sacrifice, it had to be beautiful. In a horrifying, can't look away kind of way. You feel a chill again, not from the wind, but from realization that the blood eagle wasn't chaos. It was order, a ritual of justice cloaked in belief, a spectacle that turned punishment into prophecy. And as strange as it sounds, there may have been people warriors, even who volunteered for it in certain contexts, for glory, for legacy, for Odin. But just as you begin to feel the weight of it, one of the Vikings near the fire mutters something. That breaks the moment. They'll be telling this story long after we're gone. And he's right. Because tonight you are. The fire has burned low now, casting long shadows on the blood-stained snow. And the circle of Vikings begins to drift apart, silent, solemn, reverent. But you stay, rooted to the frozen ground, because something is gnawing at you. It's not the horror of what you just witnessed or the eerie calm of the executioners. It's the logistics. How exactly did this thing work? You shift your eyes to the space where the condemned once knelt, and the question begins to unravel itself in your mind. If the blood eagle was more than poetic metaphor, if it actually happened, what did it require? Could the human body even survive such a grotesque transformation? You step closer to the memory of that altar, your breath a visible ghost in the air. Let's talk anatomy. So here's the idea. After binding the victim face down, sometimes to a wooden board, sometimes to the cold earth, the executioner would make 2 long incisions down the back, cutting through skin and muscle to expose the rib cage. So far, unpleasant but medically plausible. You've heard of modern surgeries that slice deep into the back, though not with iron daggers and no anesthesia. Now here's where things start to snap. Literally. Each rib was then hacked away from the spine and pulled outward, spread like wings, according to the sagas. And no, they didn't use surgical rib spreaders. This was bone-breaking, tendon-tearing work. The ribs, yanked outward, would theoretically create the image of avian wings unfurling from the man's back. You can picture it morbidly beautiful. In a way, like a fallen angel carved in raw red lines. But here's the kicker: the lungs. They were supposedly pulled out through the openings and draped over the spread ribs to complete the eagle-like appearance. Yes, lungs, those spongy, delicate organs that normally sit snugly in your chest. Could that happen without immediate death? Well, not easily. The moment you puncture the chest cavity, you risk collapse of the lungs, a condition modern medicine calls pneumothorax. Add in blood loss, nerve damage, and sheer shock, and you're looking at minutes to live. Maybe. Unless, of course, the executioner avoided major arteries, avoided slicing too deep, kept the man breathing, barely, as each bone snapped away like firewood. It's a grim puzzle. Historians still debate the whole thing. Some insist that the blood eagle could only be symbolic. Others argue that the Vikings, masters of both shipbuilding and anatomical butchery, could have made it work at least for long enough to send their message. A few even point out that early medieval texts have surprisingly detailed anatomical observations. After all, these were people who knew how to process livestock down to the sinew. Why not humans? You crouch near the imaginary altar, tracing a finger through the red-black stain still fresh in your imagination. You're not squeamish, well, not anymore. But even you feel a twist in your gut when considering how much control this act required. And here's a chilling thought. What if it wasn't meant to be entirely fatal? Some fringe scholars suggest that the initial stages of the ritual, The slicing, the rib cracking might have been done not to kill immediately, but to immobilize, to shock, to open a conversation with the gods. The final part, the lung removal, would come only at the end. Once the soul was hovering near. It's hard to say. The sagas don't provide operating instructions. And the archaeological record, so far, it's gone quiet. No preserved skeletons with flared open ribs or carved spines have been found. But then again, bodies exposed to this kind of trauma would likely have been burned or buried in secret. So we're left with stories like that of King Edmund of East Anglia, one of many martyrs said to have been brutalized by Norse invaders. He wasn't a blood eagle victim, technically, but his legendary execution, being tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, then beheaded, shares the same ritualistic overtones. The need to perform death as if it were a divine transaction. You hear a crack in the distance. A deer, maybe. Or just your imagination pushing back. The fire is embers now, but in your mind, the process replays, flesh parted, ribs split, lungs displayed. A silent audience, no camera. No witnesses outside the ring, and yet we remember. There's something disturbingly elegant about it, the juxtaposition of precision and savagery. The thought that someone might endure the worst pain imaginable, not for justice, but for meaning, or revenge, or spectacle. And speaking of meaning, let's take a sideways step for a moment. There's a theory, one of the more deliciously strange ones, that the blood eagle was designed to mimic a transformation from man to bird, from mortal to messenger. Some link it to shamanic rituals where spiritual flight was symbolized by actual wings. The lungs, as a stand-in for breath, for life, were literally unfurled into the air. Sound far-fetched? Sure, but remember, this is a culture that believed the world was held together by a tree, that the dead could drink with the gods, and that poetry was a gift stolen from a giant's spit. Literalism wasn't always the priority. You look up. The stars have come out, scattered like runes across the black sky. Somewhere above, the Norse would say, Odin watches. His two ravens Hugin and Munin fly over the earth, bringing him news. Maybe they saw this ritual once. Maybe they carried the victim's last breath into the clouds, or maybe it never happened at all. That's the tension you're living in now. The space between truth and myth, between cracked ribs and poetic justice. And as you finally rise from your imaginary kneel, brushing ash from your knees, you realize something sobering. If this ritual was real, if even one person met their end this way, then the sagas are not exaggerations, they're warnings. But if it wasn't real, if it was just the fever dream of a monk or a bard, then it's even more powerful. Because the blood eagle becomes not just a tale of death, but of belief. And belief that can cut deeper than any knife. You leave the clearing slowly now, stepping over invisible footprints and fading echoes, still haunted by the rhythmic sound of bones being spread like branches. But as the cold night follows you deeper into the woods of memory, a different voice begins to whisper in your ear. Did it even happen? You pause. Because, let's be honest, this isn't a casual question. It's the core of the whole mystery. The blood eagle, real or poetic horror fiction. You've seen how the saga paints. It's so vivid, so deliberate. But something in the back of your mind nudges you. That sounds too cinematic, too theatrical, almost crafted. So tonight, Let's slow our pace and dig into the real debate. Was the blood eagle even a real Viking ritual, or just a terrifying tale retold one too many times? You push through a curtain of pine needles, and before you now is a strange new camp, not Viking this time, but filled with scribes, men in robes, quills scratching, scrolls unfurling. Welcome to the world of early chroniclers. You sit beside one monk. He's writing by candlelight, the flame dancing wildly as if offended by the tale being recorded. The parchment reads like a nightmare. It describes the sons of Ragnar executing Kingle with an eagle carved in his back, his ribs pulled outward, his lungs displayed. But the monk doesn't pause to clarify. Did he witness it? No. Did he hear it firsthand? Also no. So where did this come from? That's the first twist in the historical fog. Our earliest sources for the blood eagle don't come from the Viking Age itself. They come from much later, often centuries after. The events they describe. And even more tellingly, they weren't written by Vikings. They were penned by Christian monks. Now, this is where things get spicy. You lean forward as the monk dips his quill again. Because there's a possibility, whispered through centuries of scholarship, that the blood eagle was never performed, but instead invented by them, the monks. Why would they do that? Simple. Propaganda. The Norsemen were terrifying. They raided monasteries, burned towns, and took slaves. But they were also human. And to rally Christian Europe against them, the church needed to paint them as something more than human, as monsters. And what better way to do that than to describe an execution? So awful, so unholy, that it chills the bones centuries later. So maybe the blood eagle wasn't just a story. Maybe it was a weapon, not against enemies, but against perception. You blink. The monk's fire is gone now, replaced with the quiet scratch of another pen, this time in Iceland. A few hundred years later, Viking descendants began writing down the oral sagas that had been passed around fires for generations. You peek over the shoulder of an Icelandic scribe as he writes a story that includes a curious line. They carved an eagle in Thane, his back. But what does that mean? Did they really mean all that slicing and cracking? Or could it be poetic language? Some scholars argue that carving the eagle was metaphor. Maybe it meant marking the back with a sword as a sign of vengeance. Maybe it meant death at the hands of someone claiming victory in Odin's name. Maybe it was symbolic, like drawing a winged figure to mark the dishonor of betrayal. Others say it's all been mistranslated. The Old Norse is vague, ambiguous, maybe even deliberately mysterious. Like so many Viking phrases, it leans into metaphor so hard it practically topples into myth. Historians still argue whether the original phrases were ever meant to be taken literally. Some point to the vivid details as proof of authenticity. Others shrug and say, "Have you read Viking poetry? These are the same people who described a sword as a wound icicle. Accuracy wasn't the priority. Imagery was king." And here's a fun tidbit. The term blood eagle doesn't even show up in early sources. That label came later attached by modern readers trying to name the horror. So what if we've taken poetic language and spun it into a horror film, complete with screams and dripping blades? As you walk between the scribes, you feel the story unraveling and reforming with every step. The sagas, the Christian chronicles, the archaeology, or lack of it. Each piece adds color to the tale, but none of them prove anything. Still, it feels real, doesn't it? You feel the chill of the fjords, hear the crunch of snow under leather boots, smell the iron in the air. Whether real or not, the blood eagle taps into something primal, a need to make death memorable, to turn justice into performance. And whether Vikings ever truly opened someone's back like pages in a book, or whether they just imagined it, that says something too. One historian puts it best: even if it never happened, it was believed to have happened. And that belief mattered. You turn now, the scribes fading behind you. The path ahead is darker, leading you deeper into saga country. Myth and truth are so tightly braided now, it's hard to say where one ends and the other begins. But the real question isn't just whether it happened, it's why we keep returning to it, why we're fascinated, why we whisper it at midnight, why it lingers in our stories and in the corners of our imagination. You pause at the edge of the woods, looking out across frozen fields, and somewhere in the deep silence of winter, you think you hear it again. The slow crack of ribs, or maybe just a branch. Either way, it makes you wonder. The wind cuts across the empty fields now, soft but persistent, like the lingering edge of a memory you can't quite shake. You pull your cloak tighter as you step over a patch of flattened grass and approach what looks like an ancient gathering place, a circle of stones half sunk into the earth. This isn't just a fire pit. It's a stage, because now you're slipping into the mind of the Viking storyteller, the skald. Not a warrior with a sword, but one with a tongue so sharp it could carve its own legends into eternity. You crouch beside one of these skalds as he sharpens not a blade, but a verse. He speaks in rhythm, his voice thick with metaphor, his words heavy with layers of meaning. Here, in the Viking world, storytelling isn't entertainment, it's memory, reputation, magic, and it's through these poetic minds that the blood eagle survived. Let's be honest, oral culture is a game of firelit telephone. Every time a story is told, something shifts. A name is embellished, a detail is exaggerated. Maybe the execution was simple once, just a sword to the back. But over decades, even centuries, the story spread its wings. Literally, the skald beside you sways with the words as he describes the eagle carved in the back of a trader, his lungs pulled out and fluttering in the wind. You glance at the children listening, their eyes wide. They're terrified, sure, but they're also awed, spellbound. And maybe, deep down, they're taking notes, because the saga wasn't just about entertainment. It was instruction. It told you what happened to oathbreakers, what happened to kings who crossed the wrong men, what vengeance looked like when it took flight. So where do these tales live? Primarily in the Icelandic sagas written in the 13th and 14th centuries. These collections, like the Orkneyinga saga, the tale of Ragnar's sons, and Heimskringla, contain some of the juiciest descriptions of Viking justice. But again, they were penned long after the Viking Age had ended. By then, Christianity had spread. The culture was already shifting. The people writing these stories were descendants of warriors, yes, but also of scribes, farmers, and monks. They weren't carving runes into stones anymore. They were carving tales into vellum. And the blood eagle? It was one of their darkest, most haunting verses. You reach for the tale of Ragnar's sons, That infamous saga where the sons of Ragnar avenged their father by capturing King Gley and, yes, carving the eagle into his back. But earlier versions of the tale don't mention lungs or ribs or blood. They just say he was slain or killed with an eagle. See the difference? It wasn't until the Skalds got their hands on it that the eagle got its wings. You picture it now, a storyteller warming his hands beside a fire, spinning his tale for a crowd of warriors eager for vengeance and glory. The story begins as a whisper, "He cut the eagle into his back," and grows with each retelling until it's become something monstrous, beautiful, impossible to ignore. And here's where the quirky bit comes in. One fringe theory says the eagle might not have been a reference to a bird at all, but to a standard Viking sword technique. A kind of stylized slash across the back meant to leave an eagle-like pattern of wounds. Sounds convenient, right? But others argue it was always meant to be poetic, that the real punishment wasn't in the act, it was in the story. Because if someone carved an eagle into your back, whether literally or metaphorically, your name was done. Your legacy was tainted. You were not just killed. You were erased and rewritten. That's what Skalds did. They didn't just record history, they controlled it. They could elevate you to myth or plunge you into villainy. And sometimes they did both. Like in the case of Halfdan Longleg, a Viking noble mentioned in the Orkneyinga saga. He was said to have killed his enemy, male Brit, and possibly subjected him to the blood eagle as revenge. But it's only a faint mention, one line, quickly passed over. And yet, here we are, still talking about it. You take a seat by the stones again, running your fingers along the icy moss. It's easy to forget that history often survives not in artifacts, but in stories. And stories? They love drama. That's the gift of the Skald. And the curse of the historian. So here's the scholarly tug-of-war. If the Skalds shaped the blood eagle into a grand legend, should we treat it as metaphor? Or as a reflection of something real that was simply stretched for impact? Historians still argue whether the sagas were ever meant to be taken as literal accounts or symbolic roadmaps for a warrior culture obsessed with honor, loyalty, and the afterlife. Some say the blood eagle was a warning cloaked in verse. Others think it was a fantasy woven by poets looking to make Norse vengeance more theatrical than Roman gladiators. And yet, through all that doubt, something inside you hesitates to dismiss it. Because you were there, remember. You saw the fire, the circle of men, the lungs like wings. And whether it was real or not, whether it happened once or never at all, it felt true. And maybe that's what matters most in the end. You rise, brushing cold dust from your hands, and look once more at the circle of stones. The storyteller is gone now. The fire is out. But the words? They're still here, waiting to be believed. The snow deepens as you climb higher, now following the path of stories rather than footsteps. The pine trees thin, and in the distance, a longhouse looms, its wooden beams weathered by time, its roof sagging under the weight of 1,000 winters. Inside, a fire crackles. But this is no cozy hearth. This is a war council, and the mood is heavy. You step into the smoky room and join the circle, where Viking leaders, jarls, and kings are seated, fists clenched, brows low. They're debating something, and even, without understanding every word, you know the name at the center of the storm. A traitor, a rival, a man who has wronged the clan, and the punishment being discussed, you guessed it. The Blood Eagle, but not for just anyone. You settle in the shadows, listening as the room pulses with names and grudges. This isn't casual justice. The Blood Eagle wasn't handed out like speeding tickets. No, this particular fate was reserved for a certain kind of enemy, one who had earned not just death, but theater. That's what we explore tonight. Who received the Blood Eagle, and why not? Because even if the ritual happened rarely or only in story, it wasn't meant for just anyone. It was a statement. And the person at the center of that statement had to be special. Let's rewind. The sagas tell us that the Blood Eagle was reserved for oathbreakers, betrayers, and rival kings, not the average thief or unlucky soldier. If your name was spoken in the same breath as this punishment, it meant you were powerful, dangerous, or had committed a crime so personal, so violating, that it demanded something more than the blade. Take King Gley of Northumbria. As we've heard, he's the most famous victim of the Blood Eagle. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons, he was captured by Ragnar Lothbrok's boys and given this grisly send-off in revenge for killing their father. But Gla wasn't just any king. He was a Christian monarch in an age when Viking raids were devastating the British Isles. He was symbolic, an enemy of the gods as far as Norse vengeance was concerned. So if they performed the Blood Eagle on him, it wasn't just for family honor, it was spiritual warfare. You glance around the longhouse. The warriors aren't casually deciding whether someone deserves the axe or the rope. They're weighing something heavier. Should this man be remembered as a fallen enemy or as an example? It's not a simple call. Performing the Blood Eagle wasn't just grisly, it was risky. If you did it, you'd be remembered for it. And that meant taking on the weight of the act, too. Which brings us to another story. Halfdan Longleg, the son of King Harald Fairhair. According to Orkney Inga saga, he performed the Blood Eagle on his enemy Mael Brit, a Scottish chieftain. But the text is vaguely hinting that the eagle was carved into his back. Was it literal? Was it poetic? Once again, we're left wondering. But either way, one thing is clear. Mael Brit wasn't just any opponent. He was someone important enough to warrant this mythical death. That's a pattern. The Blood Eagle, if it ever happened, wasn't about causing pain. It was about displaying power. Like a public monument made of flesh, you didn't just kill your enemy. You made sure everyone remembered it. And maybe that's the point. You glance across the fire-lit faces of the longhouse. Again, these men rough, scarred, eyes like iron, don't speak often. But when they do, their words carry centuries. To them, death is familiar. But how one dies, that's everything. To be slain in battle? That's honorable. To be executed with a sword? Acceptable, but to be Blood Eagled? That means you mattered, even if in the worst way. You rise quietly and step outside, the cold rushing back into your lungs. Behind you, the debate continues. Names will be named, decisions made, and someone somewhere is going to lose more than just their life. The night is darker now, the stars fewer. You think back to those Viking ideals, honor, vengeance, fame. This wasn't just a culture of violence. It was a culture of story. And the worst punishment wasn't death, it was to be forgotten. Which ironically makes the Blood Eagle the ultimate backwards honor. It turned your corpse into a message board. You weren't just dead, you were part of a warning. A legend. And you want one more little twist? Some scholars have pointed out that those who received the blood eagle, if they endured it without screaming, might still have earned a place in Valhalla, the very hall of Odin. That means even in your destruction, you could achieve greatness. It's a paradox. You're punished because you mattered. And if you die well, you're still heroic. Now that's Viking logic. You take one last look at the longhouse, its smoke curling into the stars like a thin gray serpent. Then you turn back toward the woods. The ground is slick with ice. Each step is heavier now, as if weighed down by the stories of those who came before. And above you, somewhere in the quiet sky, a raven circles. Watching. Always watching. The raven's cry fades behind you as the forest thickens once more, branches brushing your shoulders like the arms of forgotten spirits, silent, watchful, and impossibly old. But you're not alone in this place, because tonight you're not chasing ghosts, you're chasing Odin. You emerge into a moonlit glade, and there he is, not in body, of course, but in spirit. The Allfather, one-eyed, wandering, wise. And whether you believe in gods or not, Odin looms over everything we've discussed so far, because if the blood eagle was real, or even if it was just believed, it wasn't only about vengeance, it was about sacrifice. And Odin? He's the one who demanded it. You settle onto a boulder slick with frost and try to place yourself inside the Viking mindset. This is where things get slippery. Because to them, death wasn't the end. It was a crossing, a test, a transition from one kind of existence to another. And Odin? He was the gatekeeper. He wasn't a god of comfort. No heavenly hugs and pearly gates here. Odin was a god of war, wisdom, and death, and not always in that order. He was complex, distant, sacrificing, demanding, the kind of deity who gave up his own eye just to see more clearly, who hanged himself from a tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes. Now think about that. A god who suffers to gain wisdom, who bleeds to gain power. Sound familiar? You can almost see the echoes in the blood eagle. A man tied, a chest opened, breath taken, pain endured for meaning, for judgment, for eternity. Historians still argue whether the blood eagle had any direct connection to ritual sacrifice, the kind offered to Odin during critical moments of war or famine. Some say it was purely secular vengeance. Others, though, see something more, a deeply spiritual performance, reenacting the kind of devotion Odin himself exemplified. And here's where we step into the wild. You might be surprised to learn that the cake within today, Vikings didn't just sacrifice animals. There are documented accounts, both in Norse texts and from Arab travelers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, of human sacrifices conducted during special ceremonies, usually slaves, sometimes enemies, always deliberate. In one such account, a slave girl is said to have volunteered, yes, volunteered to be killed and buried with her master during a ship funeral. She drinks, chants, and is ritually stabbed to accompany him to the afterlife. It's chilling. But to the Norse, it was noble, and it reinforces the mindset. Death wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was offering. Now imagine this: a warrior or a traitor, bound and still breathing, his lungs pulled outward toward the sky. What if this act was seen not just as cruelty, but as a sacred act, a final, brutal communion with the divine. You can almost hear the priests, cloaked in bearskin, chanting in Old Norse, not for mercy, but for recognition that this man is no longer just a man. He's a vessel, and Odin is watching. You glance upward again. The stars are sharp tonight, cold and clear like silver splinters in a black ocean. In Norse cosmology, this sky isn't just sky. It's a veil, thin and trembling, separating the world of men from the halls of gods. And that makes you wonder, could the blood eagle have been a bridge? A way to send someone, perhaps an enemy, perhaps even an honored soul, across that veil in a way so violent, so unforgettable, that the gods had to take notice. You shift uncomfortably. It's a romantic thought in a savage way. But let's not forget, this ritual, if real, was agony incarnate. You're not suggesting it was noble, just that it might have been more than punishment. In Viking society, public rituals carried weight. They had to mean something. You didn't perform a blood eagle in secret. You did it where everyone could see, because part of its power came from the witnesses, the gossip, the fear. And fear? That's a kind of prayer, too. So maybe this wasn't just about sending a message to the gods. Maybe it was about sending a message to the living. A divine postmark stamped in blood and bone. Cross us, and this is what happens. Not just death, but sacred death. Ugly, yes, but holy. And isn't that the ultimate paradox? The same ritual that might have honored Odin also terrified entire villages. It told warriors, your loyalty matters, your choices echo. Your body, in the end, might become the proof of your soul's worth or your failure. And what about the feathers? Remember those from earlier? There's no confirmed record of feathers being used in the blood eagle ritual, but some fringe theories suggest they might have symbolized the connection to Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Two birds circling the world, whispering news back to the Allfather. Two lungs, splayed open, trembling in the cold air. Coincidence? Or an invitation? You stand again, brushing frost from your sleeves. The forest behind you is whispering now, not words, just wind. But somehow it feels like it knows this wasn't just violence. It was meaningful violence, and that's what sets it apart from mere execution. The blood eagle wasn't meant to be efficient. It was meant to echo through generations, through poetry, through the halls of Odin himself. As you walk away from the glade, your footprints trailing behind like soft runes, you feel the weight of that realization settle on your shoulders. If this ritual was performed, even just once, it wasn't the work of madmen. It was the work of believers. The path ahead is rough, now strewn with roots and lined with standing stones, some broken, some leaning like sleeping sentinels. You walk slowly, almost reverently, because this part of the journey isn't about the act itself anymore. It's about what came after. Tonight, we enter the aftermath, the psychological and cultural consequences of the blood eagle, because real or not, the mere idea of it left a scar, not just on enemies, but on Viking society itself. You reach a fork in the path and pause. One trail leads to the battlefield, steel, shields, the chaos of clashing armies. The other, a quiet hall, hearths burning, children whispering stories. Before sleep, strangely, it's that second path that held the blood eagle the longest. Because let's face it, while warriors might perform the violence, it's the community that carries the memory. You step inside the imagined hall, it's wooden, beams thick with smoke and song. And there, beside the hearth, you see them children, sitting cross-legged, wide-eyed. A woman leans in close, her voice soft but firm. "He betrayed the clan," she says, "so they made an eagle of him." You almost smile, because it's not just punishment anymore. It's lore, and that's the thing when a story like the Blood Eagle enters the bloodstream of a culture. It doesn't just stay in the battlefield. It gets passed on, rewritten, retold. It becomes a mirror of what a people fear and what they value. Historians still argue whether Norse communities accepted the Blood Eagle as part of their legal system. Most agree it was outside the usual justice. After all, Norse law was surprisingly robust, built around compensation, negotiation, even public courts. Eye for an eye? Sure, but this was theatrical, which means it wasn't just justice, it was ritualized terror. And that kind of spectacle doesn't fade quickly. You sit by the hearth as the woman finishes her story, the children now hushed. Outside, the wind howls through gaps in the walls. And you realize that even hundreds of years ago, this story was being used to teach not facts, but feeling. The Blood Eagle warned you to stay loyal, to keep your oaths, to protect your kin. Because breaking those bonds didn't just mean exile. It meant your name would live on in the worst way. That's a chilling idea. Even now, you pull your cloak tighter as you leave the hall and return to the forest. The wind bites harder. You pass a tree marked with carved runes, ancient words. Barely legible now, but you recognize one symbol, Fey, the rune of wealth, but also of danger and moral debt. Fascinating, isn't it? Because the Blood Eagle was often tied to betrayal of kin or clan, a moral debt that no amount of silver could repay. So instead, they paid in pain. In pain, unlike silver, doesn't rust. Let's talk ripple effects. Picture this: a nearby village hears whispers that a rival chieftain was given the eagle. They're horrified, but they're also reassured. Their leaders are strong enough to enforce vengeance. Their gods are still watching. Justice, however brutal, still walks the land. And that reassurance, it seeps into daily life, into customs, into bedtime stories and drinking songs, into the way you raise your sons to be loyal, to be brave, and your daughters to choose wisely who they trust. You hear a song now, low, melodic, drifting on the breeze. It's in Old Norse, a verse from a skaldic poem that tells of a man who died with wings of blood. The melody is almost pretty, which makes it all the more disturbing, because beauty and brutality were never opposites to the Norse. They were partners. Even today, echoes remain. In Scandinavian literature, in black metal lyrics, in fantasy novels, in historical fiction. The Blood Eagle keeps coming back, not because we crave violence, but because we're still haunted by the idea that justice can be so personal, so symbolic, so permanently etched into the flesh. You pause at a stone cairn, just a pile of rocks, really, but one that feels important. Maybe someone's buried here, maybe not. But if they are, and if they died by eagle, their bones would have carried the signs. Or so you'd think. But guess what? We haven't found a single skeleton with flared ribs or split spines to confirm. And yet, we believe, because sometimes fear writes itself more deeply than archaeology ever could. You place your hand on the cairn. It's cold, solid, and silent. The stones don't speak, but the absence of speech. That's something, because silence, too, can be a legacy. You wonder what it must have been like to live in a time when betrayal could mean not just death, but eternal humiliation. When your enemies could rewrite your ending in the most unforgettable way. And when your children, if they survived, would spend the rest of their lives answering for the shape of your back. The weight of that. It's more than historical. It's human. And that, you realize, is the real aftermath. Not the blood. Not the wings. Not even the story. It's the way it echoes quietly, relentlessly, through generations. You turn away from the cairn and begin your descent through the forest, the trees thicker now, the wind higher. And just as you think the silence might consume you, you hear it again. Story, spoken by someone else, retold, reimagined, reborn, because some legends never die, especially the ones that bleed. The trees thin once more, and this time the landscape opens into something stranger, less forest, more memory. You're walking through a museum now, but not the kind with clean white walls and guided audio tours. No, this one is shadowy, dusty, filled with glass cases that creak when you pass, and displays that blink slowly as if remembering they're supposed to be watched. Welcome to the modern obsession, because for something as uncertain, as possibly mythical as the blood eagle, it has a very firm grip on the 21st century imagination. And tonight, as you drift through this imagined museum of the mind, we're asking, why does the blood eagle still fascinate us? You pause at the first display. It's a book well-worn, dog-eared, resting on a plinth. The label reads, Historical Fiction, circa 1990. The passage is highlighted. They carved the wings into his back, and the gods watched as he bled. There it is again. U-turn, a shelf of fantasy novels. Then a screen showing an episode from a gritty historical drama, torches, chanting, ribs, the works. Further along, video game artwork, and past that, a metal band's album cover. All black and red and thunder and teeth. The blood eagle, everywhere. And yet most of the people who invoke it today don't know the sagas. They don't know the debates or the linguistic ambiguity. They just feel it. The power, the grotesque beauty, the myth. Why? Maybe because the blood eagle walks a perfect line between fact and nightmare. It sounds like something that could have happened. Maybe even did. And in a world where history often feels sanitized or distant, a ritual this primal pulls you in like gravity. It demands you imagine it, react to it, question it. That's the spell. Historians still argue whether modern media does more harm than good by dramatizing the blood eagle. Some say it distorts an already fragile truth. Others shrug and say, hey, at least people are talking about Viking history again. And that's true. Popular culture has given the Norse world new oxygen, but it's also shaped the ritual in very specific ways. You peer into another glass case, this one containing a TV script. The scene, a Viking warlord slowly, methodically slicing open a trader's back while chanting in Old Norse. Torches flicker, lightning cracks. The victim doesn't scream. It's cinematic. It's haunting, It's oddly spiritual, but also completely stylized. Because, let's be honest, if this was ever performed, it probably didn't look like a scene from an award-winning series. There were no camera angles, no perfect lighting, just cold wind, rough hands, and a body on a stone. And yet, we've transformed it into theater, into meme, into legend. You lean closer to a faded poster on the wall now. It's from a traveling museum exhibit. Vikings, warriors of the North. In the corner, a small mention of the infamous blood eagle, accompanied by a caution. Details unconfirmed, possibly symbolic. Even museums' supposed temples of fact can't resist the draw. You move deeper into a darker part of the museum. Here, the displays are less curated. A YouTube thumbnail with a screaming face and blood-red title, Viking's most brutal ritual, you won't believe it. Next to it, a Reddit thread with hundreds of comments debating whether the lungs were pulled out before or after the ribs were broken. And here comes the quirky part. One post suggests the blood eagle was originally inspired by a misinterpreted bird migration ritual involving offering feathers to Odin. Another argues it was symbolic of setting the soul free to fly. You can't help but smile. Humanity never changes. We interpret. We embellish. We need stories to fit our fears and fascinat. ION say. And in the blood eagle, we found the perfect template. You pause by a final display. A mirror. Not fancy. Just simple glass. But when you look into it, you realize this museum isn't about history at all. It's about us. Because rituals like the blood eagle, whether real or imagined, survive because we're drawn to the extremes, to the edge of what people will do to each other, to themselves. We want to believe in lines we'd never cross. And yet, we inch toward them with every retelling. Why does the blood eagle still fascinate? Because it speaks to something ancient. In us. Not just fear, but awe. Awe at what people are capable of. Awe at the darkness that can coexist with ritual and honor. Awe at the way a single story, told by firelight 1,000 years ago, can still echo in our ears when the lights go out. You step back from the mirror. The museum fades. You're back in the woods now, but everything feels closer. You can almost hear the chanting, the breath, the final gasp. And whether it happened once or only ever in our minds, you feel its weight, still pressing, still whispering, still waiting to be told. The forest grows still again, the ground muffled beneath a soft blanket of frost. You're deeper than ever now, past history, past story, past spectacle. And in this silence, a new question emerges, one that hums low and strange like distant thunder in your chest. Could the blood eagle even be anatomically possible? You didn't expect to ask that, did you? And yet here you are, standing before a slab of cold stone that looks uncomfortably like a surgical table. Not a battlefield, not a temple, but a place of process, of mechanics. Because tonight, you're not a storyteller or a Viking. You're something closer to a forensic pathologist peering into the space where legend and human anatomy collide. Let's break it down according to the most detailed descriptions, many of which came long after. The Viking Age, the blood eagle, involved several steps. The victim was tied face down or kneeling. Incisions were made along the back, slicing through the skin and muscle to expose the ribs. The ribs were then severed from the spine and splayed outward like the wings of a bird. The lungs were pulled out and draped over the shoulders still intact, possibly still inflating. It sounds nightmarish. It is nightmarish, but the question is, could it physically happen? You crouch beside the stone now, tracing your fingers along imagined grooves where tools might have lain. You picture the ribs curved, tight, fixed closely to the spine, not easily pried apart, not without effort or knowledge. And there's the first challenge: tools. The Vikings were brilliant craftsmen. Their swords were legendary. Their axes could split shields, but performing this procedure, that would require a kind of precision cutting through tough muscle and cartilage, splitting bone, avoiding immediate fatal damage. It's not just about pain tolerance. It's about time. And here's where science starts whispering back. Modern forensic experts and anatomists have weighed in, and the consensus is ... complicated. Could you cut someone open and expose their ribs? Yes. Could you manually break and splay those ribs out like wings? Possibly with tremendous force or sharp, specific tools. Could you then remove the lungs and drape them over the shoulders? Technically, yes. But here's the clincher. Not while the person was alive, because once you puncture the pleural cavity, the sealed space around the lungs, you trigger a collapse. Breathing stops rapidly. Shock sets in. Blood loss skyrockets. And while adrenaline is powerful, it's no match for physics. Historians still argue whether the descriptions of the victim not screaming during the blood eagle were signs of stoicism or just literary flair. But anatomists? They tend to agree a person wouldn't survive past the second or third step. Their body would shut down long before the ritual reached full eagle. So what does that tell us? Maybe it was done post-mortem, a kind of ritual display after death. Still gruesome, still horrifying, but not torture, just spectacle. Or maybe it was never done at all, just described in such vivid, poetic terms that later generations took it literally. Again, the Old Norse language is notoriously metaphor-heavy. A phrase like carved an eagle might have meant anything from drawing blood to leaving a symbolic mark of vengeance. And yet, despite the anatomical unlikelihood, we can't fully dismiss it, because people have done stranger things. You step away from the slab and find yourself in a clearing filled with history's other impossible punishments. The Chinese death by 1,000 cuts, medieval drawing and quartering, Roman crucifixion, all horrific, all seemingly unthinkable, all real. So maybe the blood eagle fits right in. Maybe it wasn't about efficiency or survivability. Maybe it was a statement so extreme, so unhinged, that its impracticality was the point. A death so elaborate that it became immortal. Not because it happened often, but because it could happen. And that's scarier, isn't it? You don't need proof that a nightmare exists. You just need to believe it's possible. A branch snaps in the distance. You flinch. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's the weight of that realization landing on your shoulders, because the blood eagle, anatomically, shouldn't have worked. But psychologically, it worked perfectly. It left behind something far more enduring than bone or lung tissue, a blueprint for fear. One that didn't need to be performed again and again to be effective. One that lived on in whispers, warnings, and sagas. You take one last glance at the slab. Imagine blood darkens the edges. You can almost hear the shallow breath of someone kneeling beside it, not screaming, not pleading, just waiting. And whether they were real or fictional, that's the part that stays with you. The silence, because sometimes the quietest moments in history leave the loudest echoes. You're walking now beneath a bruised sky lavender fading into gray. The last light of dusk pulled behind the horizon like a blood-streaked curtain. The forest is gone. The battlefield is gone. Even the longhouses feel distant now. What's left? Just stories, but not the big booming kind with swords and shouting. No, these are the quiet ones, the whispers, the side characters, the forgotten voices. Tonight, you're chasing the aftershocks of the Blood Eagle, not the kings who might have ordered it, or the warriors who might have performed it, but the ones who had to watch, the bystanders, the scribes, the servants, the survivors. You duck into a low-slung building, wooden, smoky, full of the scent of old tallow and damp wool. This is no place of glory. It's a place of waiting. And inside, a woman face lined with smoke and worry pulls her, shawl tighter as she whispers a name you recognize, a man who betrayed her clan, a man she once loved, a man they say died with an eagle on his back. And just like that, you're face to face with one of the strangest aspects of rituals like this. Their power doesn't end with the victim. It ripples outward, staining everyone connected to them. Families, friends, neighbors, enemies. Because in Viking society, as brutal as it could be, there was still an intense sense of community, of shared myth, of shared responsibility. And when someone was punished this severely, everyone felt it. You step outside again, the night wind colder now, and you realize we've talked a lot about what the Blood Eagle did to the victim, but what about the executioner? Imagine being the one chosen to do it. Maybe you're the brother of the slain, seeking revenge. Maybe you're the Jarl's most loyal soldier, bound by oath. Or maybe you're just the one who drew the short straw. How would it change you? Historians still argue whether executioners in Viking society were reviled or revered. Some suggest they were outsiders, people with no choice. Others argue they were held in esteem, praised for their strength and loyalty. Either way, the psychological toll must have been enormous. Because this wasn't just a beheading. It wasn't a clean kill. It was personal, intimate, prolonged. You had to touch the back, feel the bones, open the ribs, hold the lungs. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It etches. And what about the scribe? The one who wrote it down in the sagas hundreds of years later. Was he horrified, fascinated, trying to warn us? Or simply trying to outdo the storyteller who came before him? Because sometimes the most chilling thing isn't the act itself, but the calm precision with which it's recorded. One line in Tale of Ragnar's Sons reads, almost offhandedly, they caused an eagle to be carved into Glay's back and his ribs to be cut from the spine and pulled out. No screaming, no panic, just facts. And then they move on to the next battle. You continue walking, your breath ghosting in front of you. You're not sure where you are anymore, not in time, not in space. Because this space of memory isn't on any map. You pass a grave marker, half buried in moss. No name, just a symbol, a twisted rune, half faded. It might be for a victim or a witness, or someone who simply heard the story and never recovered. Because that's the thing about legendary. Violence, it doesn't have to happen often. It just has to be remembered well, and when it is, it does strange things to a culture that take the way some Viking communities began to adopt symbolic punishments. Not actual eagles, but carvings, paintings, public shaming rituals that echoed the same message. You crossed the line. Now everyone will see that in a way, the blood eagle became a template. Not just for punishment, but for remembrance. You kneel beside the marker now, brushing away the leaves. You think of the mothers who lost sons to it, the wives who had to pretend they didn't cry, the children who repeated the story without understanding it, and the men who dreamed of glory and found only silence that in the end. These are the ghosts we rarely talk about. The ones who lived, the ones who carried the stories forward. Because as powerful as the blood eagle myth is, it only survived because someone somewhere kept whispering, not just the triumph, but the cost. You rise slowly, bones aching like they've walked 1,000 winters. You hear the wind again, this time not as menace, but as a kind of lullaby. A lullaby made of breath and sorrow and soft footsteps retreating into time. And for the first time tonight, you feel something different. Not horror. But grief. Because somewhere behind the cruelty, the ritual, the bones and lungs and wings, there was a person. And around that person, there were others. Watching. Waiting. Never forgetting. There's frost in your eyelashes now, not the glittery kind. The kind that clings, delicate and unwelcome, like memories you didn't ask to remember. You're far from the sagas, far from the longhouse, far from the axe and altar. What's ahead is something colder, quieter, and strangely more dangerous. Tonight, we enter the realm of doubt, because let's say it plainly, some scholars don't believe the blood eagle ever happened. At all. You reach a clearing where the trees grow in. Perfect circle to perfect. This place feels arranged, curated, almost academic. And on a carved bench under a silver-bark tree, you find them waiting. The skeptics, not the angry kind, not cynics. Just voices with questions, stacked manuscripts and thin glasses, lifting quills instead of axes. They welcome you, nod politely, and begin to speak. First, they ask about the sources. Where do the blood eagle stories actually come from? And here's the thing, it's murky. The most vivid accounts show up in the Icelandic sagas, mostly written centuries after the events they claim to describe. These weren't Viking eyewitnesses scribbling with ink-stained fingers as the lungs were lifted skyward. These were Christian scribes writing in the 13th century, long after Scandinavia had converted and the pagan world was fading. So you wonder, were they describing real history? Or dramatizing it? Maybe even moralizing it? There's a twinkle in the scholar's eye as they pull out an old vellum page. On it, the line describing the blood eagle carved into glass, but they point to the phrase konrista, cutting the eagle. Here's the quirky part. It might not mean carving an eagle into someone's back. It might just mean drawing a symbolic eagle. Or worse, it might be poetic shorthand for vengeance, for death, for the image of Odin's bird claiming a soul. Suddenly, things feel less certain. Historians still argue whether carving the eagle referred to a literal act of anatomical horror, or a metaphorical flourish that snowballed with each retelling. And honestly, Both options are terrifying in their own way. You walk the circle slowly, passing other skeptic displays translations, reinterpretations, linguistic breakdowns. 1. Scholar argues that the eagle was never a method of execution at all, but rather a heraldic device, symbolic of victory. Another theory suggests it was Christian propaganda, retroactively painting the pagan Vikings as bloodthirsty savages because what better way to justify their conversion than to say, look what they used to do to people? That gives you pause, because if that's true, then the blood eagle wasn't history, it was PR, religious shock marketing, the medieval equivalent of a viral headline. Something like, you won't believe what these pagan raiders did to their enemies. And you have to admit it worked, even now, over 1,000 years later. You're here, listening, imagining, shivering, not because it was proven, but because it was believed. That, perhaps, is the blood eagle's greatest power. It doesn't need to be real to have real effects. You sit beside the skeptics now, cross-legged in the circle. They're not trying to erase the story. They're trying to understand it. And the more you listen, the more you realize even doubt can be sacred, because the Norse weren't obsessed with neat answers. They told stories in spirals with truth, and legend braided so tightly that pulling one free unraveled them both. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the blood eagle was never meant to be solved like a puzzle. Maybe it was meant to be held like a burning coal, painful, mysterious, illuminating in all the wrong ways. You rise, thank the scholars, and step beyond the circle. The forest returns, wilder, less arranged. The kind of place where truths don't walk in straight lines and myths have teeth. Because even if the blood eagle never happened, it still happened. It happened in the minds of those who feared it. It happened in the dreams of children who heard it. It happened in the way enemies were buried with their backs unspoken. It happened in poems, sagas, and songs that bent toward horror, not to glorify violence, but to remind you of its power. You pause by a half-frozen stream. The water is dark, smooth as obsidian. You catch your reflection, and in that cold mirror, you see yourself layered with every version of the story you've heard tonight. The believer, the skeptic, the storyteller. And the one who doesn't know what to believe, but can't stop walking. You dip your hand into the stream. The chill stings instantly. It's real. It hurts. But it wakes something in you too, because maybe that's what the blood eagle always was. Not a ritual, not a fact, but a test of belief, of doubt, of how far we'll go to understand what we fear and why we keep whispering it in the dark. The path ahead is damp and strange now. The earth gives beneath your feet like it's remembering too much. Fog curls between the roots, thick and low, like it's trying to hide what's coming next. And what is coming? Legacy. Not the legacy of kings. Not the glory and horns Viking tourism brochure. But the darker kind, the one that sticks in the back of your throat when the campfire goes out. You've heard the story, questioned it, felt the weight of its terror and the doubt of its scholars. But now we ask, what did the blood eagle leave behind? You step carefully through the fog and arrive at a small hill overlooking the sea. There's no monument here, no plaque. Just a sense that something used to stand tall and has since been buried. That, perhaps, is the blood eagle's real tomb. Because here's the twist most people miss. Even as the legend grew more famous, the actual Norse people began moving away from such rituals. Whether it happened once, 100 times, or not at all, the idea of the blood eagle slowly faded from practice and into myth. Why? Well, for one thing, Christianity happened. By the 11th century, conversion was sweeping through Scandinavia. Slowly at first, then like a tide. Old gods gave way to new ones. Odin's one eye was replaced by the image of a bleeding man on a cross. And with that shift came new laws, new morals, and new penalties. Public torture rituals? Not exactly aligned with the Gospels. Even among Norse holdouts, the cultural center of gravity began to shift. Honor and vengeance didn't vanish, but they began to evolve. Legal codes like the Gragas in Iceland or the Landslov in Norway started formalizing conflict resolution. Blood feuds gave way to structured fines, arbitration, and even exile. The blood eagle, whether real or symbolic, just didn't fit anymore. But, and this is crucial, it didn't disappear. It just changed shape. You pass a tree where runes have been carved by modern hands. Tourist runes, Instagram runes. A shaky version of the word Karn etched next to a heart and a date. It's almost sweet, if a little unsettling. And it reminds you, the story survives, not because it's proven, but because it's vivid. In Norway, Sweden, Denmark, you'll still find the blood eagle referenced in museums, fiction, metal lyrics, Viking festivals. It's part of the branding now. The warning label on the Viking mystique. These people were not soft. And let's be honest, modern culture loves that kind of drama. You scroll through a dozen documentaries in your head. 10 of them use the blood eagle in the opening scene. It's quick, gripping. They flash an animated ribcage, some smoky chanting, maybe a raven or two. Then the title slams in. Vikings, gods of war. Boom. You're hooked. Historians still argue whether this pop culture obsession helps or hurts. Some say it oversimplifies Norse culture, reduces a deeply spiritual, complex civilization to nothing but axes and torture, and they have a point. The Vikings were traders, farmers, lawmakers, poets. Their mythology is rich, layered, tragic. Their society had checks and balances, courts, and community structures. They weren't monsters, but the blood eagle feels more than real. It's cinematic, emotional. You don't forget it, and maybe that's the real legacy. It forces you to feel, to imagine pain, to imagine loyalty, to imagine vengeance, so personal it requires a body, a blade, and the sky. You reach a rocky overlook now. The sea below is flat, silver, and endless. You can almost hear sails snapping in the wind, 1,000 years away. And here's your quirky historical tidbit for tonight. There's a village on the coast of Sweden where fishermen swear they hear cries on certain nights, wails that echo from the cliffs when the mist is thickest. They call them ronskrik, eagle screams. It's folklore, obviously, right? But someone named them. Someone remembered. Someone passed the idea forward, not as fact, but as atmosphere. The blood eagle became more than an event. It became a texture in the cultural weather. You sit on the edge of the overlook, legs dangling. Below, waves roll in slow, cold rhythm. And above you, a single raven cuts through the fog. Not two. Just one. And suddenly, you wonder, was it Hugin or Munin? Thought? Or memory? Maybe both. Because that's the paradox of legacy. it's never one thing. It's a collection of impressions stitched together by those who come after. And in the case of the Blood Eagle, that legacy is carved not in stone, but in reaction, fear, wonder, disgust, curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, a little respect, not for the act, but for the weight it carried, the silence it left behind. So as you rise and take one last look at the endless sea, you feel the legend settle around your shoulders, not as a cloak, but as a shadow, not to frighten you, just to remind you some stories don't need to be true to be felt forever. There's a hush now, the kind that feels earned. The trail is narrower than ever, winding between mossy stones and half-forgotten boundaries. As you walk, the ground softens underfoot, not mud exactly, but history. Worn down to its quietest version, we're nearing the end. And fittingly, this part of the journey is about retellings, how the Blood Eagle soared far beyond Scandinavia and landed in places you'd never expect. You duck beneath a low-hanging branch, its bark flaking like ancient vellum. A storyteller's tree, if there ever was one, and beneath it, scattered pages. Literal pages, scripts, textbooks, comic panels. The Blood Eagle, retold again and again. You pick one up. It's a screenplay. Set in a dystopian future. A rebel is made into an eagle by a tyrannical regime. It's stylized, theatrical, completely un-Viking. And yet, it borrows the ritual's essence, pain as punishment, exposure as spectacle, the body as a message. You pick up another. A high school history textbook printed in the early 2000s. A sidebar labeled, "Did you know?" offers a 2-sentence summary of the Blood Eagle, complete with a cartoon Viking holding what appears to be a turkey baster. Maybe not the most accurate. But here's the strange part. Every version, even the goofy ones, keeps something core. The idea that this was not just death, but a performance. That it mattered how someone died, because their end said something about the living. And that's not just a Viking thing. Across cultures, Aztec, Roman, Mongol, even medieval Europe, you find echoes of the same logic. Ritualized death as narrative control. A way for the victors to shape legacy. To punish not just the body, but the memory. Historians still argue whether that's exactly what the Norse intended with the Blood Eagle, or if we've grafted that theatrical lens onto them because we're the ones obsessed with symbolism. But the fact remains, every retelling is a kind of inheritance. Take, for example, the Blood Eagle's unexpected guest appearance in 20th century literature. A Norwegian poet once wrote about ribs flung like wings, grief echoing across a pine-dark fjord. No name, no saga mentioned, just the image. And still recognizable. Or consider how modern Viking-themed games and shows almost require a Blood Eagle scene. It's like a box that must be ticked. Because if you're telling a Viking story without that, is it even Viking enough? You wander further, and here's your quirky tidbit of the night. In 2018, a performance artist in Denmark staged a silent reenactment of the Blood Eagle using vegetables. No, really. Carrots for ribs, red cabbage for lungs, a silent figure kneeling. Beneath a canvas sky, they called it memory in the shape of fear. You pause at the edge of a small stream. Someone's left paper boats here, floating slowly. One is scribbled with the words, "Don't forget me." Another just has a crude drawing, an eagle with wings dripping downward. Even now, people are trying to make sense of it. to reframe it, reclaim it, because myth, once it's loose, doesn't go back into the bottle. It adapts. That's the real endurance of the blood eagle, not in its documentation, but in its mutability. Its ability to sneak into stories that have nothing to do with Vikings and still feel true. You watch the paper boats drift away, spinning slowly on the water's surface. And you realize something. The blood eagle isn't just a punishment anymore. It's a metaphor. For betrayal, for vengeance, for the terrifying beauty of ritual, for the idea that sometimes people will go to unfathomable lengths just to make a point. And as we retell it through TV, books, memes, lectures, and yes, SMR sleep stories, we're not just preserving it. We're participating in it. You glance up. The trees lean in like an audience. The leaves shift like a breath drawn before a final line, and then you hear it, your own voice, echoing softly. They made an eagle of him. You smile, because tonight, and every night it's told, the blood eagle flies again. Not on wings of bone, but of story. And in the soft quiet that follows, there's one thought left, curling gently at the edge of your mind. If stories can carve fear this deep, maybe they can carve understanding too. The sky above you is velvet now, deep, endless, gently speckled with stars. Everything is softer here. Even the wind has lost its bite. It brushes your face like a lullaby from 1,000 years ago. You've walked through saga and silence, through bone and story, through fear and folklore. And here at the edge of it all, you're ready to look back. The trail ends in a circle of standing stones. They're low and uneven, nothing like the towering monuments of Stonehenge or the polished gravestones of cathedrals. These are older, simpler, worn not by reverence, but by retelling. You take a seat on one of them. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath slow. Let this story settle, because this is where the blood eagle leaves you, not screaming, not shocked, but thoughtful, a little haunted, a little wiser. What have we learned? That the blood eagle, whether real or not, was effective. It embedded itself not in muscle or lung tissue, but in imagination. It asked a culture to consider what punishment meant, what revenge looked like, what it meant to honor the dead. By making the living remember. You remember the sagas, their strange cadence, their poetic menace. You remember the historians and their debates, parsing one line of Old Norse for decades. You remember the anatomy, the biology, the physics of it all. And you remember how little that ultimately matters when a myth feels true. Historians still argue whether the blood eagle was ever meant to be believed. Maybe it was a warning, or a boast, or a metaphor gone wild. But even now, as you sit surrounded by stars and stones, you feel its wings still stretched across the sky. And here's your last quirky insight of the night. One Scandinavian folklorist once wrote that when a story gets colder over time, it turns to steel. The blood eagle, then, it's steel, not because it cuts, but because it lasts. And as we close the circle tonight, you might wonder what to do with a tale like this. You can't exactly bring it up at brunch. You're unlikely to hear it on a children's cartoon. And yet, it's in you now. Maybe not the gore, but the gravity, the reminder that history is more than dates and kings and battles. It's also made of ritual, of fear, and of the strange ways we shape pain into meaning. So here's your final truth. The blood eagle may never have happened the way the sagas say. But it happens every time we remember it. In your quiet fascination. In your breath-held curiosity. In the way your thoughts drift now, not toward horror, but toward legacy. And now comes the wind down. You lie back in the soft grass, eyes closed. The stars blur gently. The sound of waves hums somewhere far off. Each breath comes slower than the last, like waves pulling sand gently back into the sea. The stones around you don't judge. They've heard every version. And they know how to let things go. Let the images fade now. The ribs, the wings, the saga verses whispered in torchlight. Let them float gently away, not erased, just softened, because some stories, even the sharpest ones, are meant to rock you to sleep, not to frighten you, but to remind you what it means to feel, to wonder, to remember. So breathe in, breathe out. You're safe now, far from the battlefield, far from the stones, far from the hush of distant kings and the myths they left behind. You've walked the whole road, and now it carries you home.